So good afternoon and thank you all for joining in on Zoom. And we're going to get started, and we'd like to start with Julia Richter from JFO, and we'll go over the Ed Fund Outlook, latest version.
Good afternoon, Julia Richter, JFO. There are two documents on the committee page under my name. There's the annotated guide to the Education Fund Outlook, which should look familiar to all of you. And then there's also the Education Fund Outlook that was available for the emergency board. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Which one are you going to?
Education Fund Outlook.
January 16?
Correct. Yep. So as a bit of a reminder, there's a number of steps throughout the process where we get updated information and we use that to update the yield model as you all are starting to consider the yield bill. So what was presented for the e-board was using the updated revenue forecast that you heard from Tom about last week and inputting it into the yield model. We then resolved the yields and rates following the December 1 letter construct. As you'll recall, there's really de minimis changes in the education fund forecast for FY26 and FY27, meaning that there's really no overall impact to the estimated average bill change. So you do see a slight change in the yields and a slight change in the rate, but ultimately it's rounding to the same average uniform bill change of 11.9% as we saw in the December 1 letter.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. According to the governor in his speech that we just listened to, he's proposing using, is it 105 million? To buy down from the 105 million to reduce property tax rates. So how would the numbers change if we do that?
I haven't done that modeling yet because I also just heard the budget address. I would defer to the administration in terms of their exact proposal and how they're proposing to use that money. As we know, any one-time money that's used to buy down property tax rates or property tax bills does create a one-time buy down, but then in the following year, we go back to where we were again. So that's in part what we're seeing this year. So that would hold true. We also know that decreasing any of the non-property tax revenues out of the education fund, all else equal, will cause property tax revenues to increase.
So if we take 10 million in each of the next 5 years for transportation fund, that will.
Absent any change in policy, that's 10 million that would need to be made up by property taxes.
And both items from the governor's speech are not reflected on this page.
Yes, that's correct. So I will come back if I'm asked to do that modeling. I can certainly come back and show that, but I haven't had time to do it today. You'll recall we spoke about this a little bit last week, but the other pieces that this committee is grappling with or will grapple with over the coming month or so as you work on the yield bill is how to fill the education fund, right? So we spoke about this in that yield bill decision points last week, but it's a policy decision as to how you are filling the education fund. Is it with a uniform average bill change of homestead and non-homestead being the same, or is it a different bill change between the two property classes? Is there an adjustment to the property tax credit? Are there adjustments to education expenditures? All of those those list of questions are really what you all are going to start working on and thinking about.
Representative Higley.
Yeah, can you also tell us that penny on the tax rate, property tax rate, how much that generates?
Approximately 14 million, and that's on both the homestead and the non-homestead rate.
Thank you.
Representative Brannigan.
The last two chunks of information there, working from the bottom, variable fund, available funds, I'm sorry, and stabilization reserve. Can you, is that money left over? Is that cash available or what are those things? Each line, starting from number 31.
Sure. So numbers 31 through 34 are showing the stabilization reserve, which is the reserve within the education fund in the instance that for whatever reason revenues don't perform and there's not sufficient revenue, the stabilization reserve is there to pick up for it. For instance, in the emergency board this summer, when we saw the downgrade of revenues before we had the reversions, the modeling dipped into the stabilization reserve to ensure that ed fund was fully funded. So the way that we look at this, line 31, that's the prior year stabilization reserve. So here we're looking at fiscal year 27. So in fiscal year 26, there was a stabilization reserve of 54.5 million. We see the current year stabilization reserve, meaning FY 27, because that's the year we're looking at, of 58.3 million, which corresponds with the reserve target. And the reserve target corresponds with that line 33, the 5% of prior year net appropriations. So that's what we're looking at here in lines 31 through 34. Does that answer your questions for those lines?
Yes, I think so. So that is cash money left on the table for emergency.
For emergency, yes. I guess I would say different ways to think about it. I don't know if I would say it's left on the table because you are raising property taxes to ensure that the stabilization reserve is hitting that reserve target of 5%.
Right.
So that there is a statutory provision, and I would defer to John on all of the legal framework around it. But essentially, there's this reserve target of 5%. If the education fund reserve, stabilization reserve falls below 5%, then the Joint Fiscal Committee looks at what would they recommend doing to ensure that we bring that reserve back up to 5%. And the reserve, having it be fully filled, is important for the state's bond ratings.
So it's the Joint Fiscal Committee that gets to play with these numbers. Our job is to
This is a policy decision, right? You'll recall a couple of years, so you don't need to fill the reserve. And then you would be in a position where you might be pulling into question the state's bond rating. There are other fiscal implications of that, and it's within your prerogative to do so. A couple years ago, the governor, forgive me, I don't remember what year it was, but there was the proposal of the governor to pull money from the stabilization reserve for one-time property tax buy down, and ultimately you all decided not to do that.
Yeah, I remember that. And line 35 and 36.
Yep, so line 35 is saying at the close of the prior fiscal year, how much money was left on the bottom line? How much money was on the table, unreserved, unallocated?
Okay, so that's in addition to the stabilization reserve.
Correct.
Okay.
And then line 36 is telling you current year unreserved, unallocated. So when we look at fiscal year 27 forecast, we can see right now the projection for FY 26 is that there will be 21.33 million on the bottom line.
Yeah.
We're using all of that 21.33 million to buy down property tax rates in this modeling. And we have 0.11 million on the bottom line, which in the ed fund is as close as we can get to zero. So this is using all of the money and fully funding the reserve.
It's getting pretty small there.
Is that?
Our margin is getting pretty small there. Yeah.
I think I'm.
Representative Watson, the other question? My question was around the statutory rules of the stabilization reserve, so it sounds like that's a question for John.
So I have a question. I watched community members arguing about this in my community last week. The 41% that keeps getting quoted as the amount property taxes have gone up in the last 5 years. Does that already include, is that 41% will be the amount it's gone up if the 11.9% comes into play? Or has it already gone up 41% over the last 5 years and the 11.9% is on top of that? Because that was the argument.
Okay, great question. First of all, I'll say that's not my math. And that's not my estimate. So detailed questions around it, I would defer to the tax department. My understanding is that looking at the forecasted FY 27 as the end piece. And if you have more questions, I would defer to tax.
Anyone else? I wasn't here, so I don't know where you are in your presentation, Julia. Great, thank you very much. Yes, Representative Brennan.
So I this might be a little tedious, Julia, I'm sorry, but so in the speech we just heard, he wants to take parts of the purchase and use money that now all gets dumped into the ed fund.
No, so not all purchase and use goes to the education fund. As we see here in row 4, 1/3 of purchase and use tax
Okay.
goes to the education fund.
And we'll hear the details of the proposal later this week.
Okay,
And however much non-property revenue comes out of the education fund, it needs to be made up somewhere, either through cutting expenditures out of the education fund or raising another revenue.
so the purchase and use tax really generates 153 million? A third of it goes to the ed fund. And then the rest stays somewhere else.
Transportation fund.
Okay,
And that would be, I can pull up or Sorcia can send around the revenue forecast that Tom presented last week, has all of the revenues and their forecasted amounts. And he both splits it to the funds and also tells you the total amount estimated to be raised.
I would like that if Saoirse has a chance to print that out for me. I have this booklet too. It's in the
From last
booklet?
week, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I have it then.
I can show you when later.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Appreciate it. Oh, look at all those lovely faces on the screen. Hello. So we're gonna, I'm gonna invite Julia back in regularly with that, as folks know, at some point in the session, we start adding columns to see hypothetically, what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? I imagine one of the what ifs will be the purchase and use changes. So we can understand the impact that would have on property taxes. And as she keeps it, but for the next few times that she comes back in, it won't be with new hypotheticals. It's just a chance to keep on digging into what's actually there now so everyone can get all their questions answered. So we've had a number of conversations in committee about the lowest spending and the highest spending districts and sort of the what and the why and the how. And so I asked School Boards Association, who deferred to the Business Managers Association, gracefully, to invite in some folks from districts who tend to be on the very high end or the very low end of spending. So we can just better understand what is included in spending. Really appreciate these witnesses for coming in. And I want to caution us that just because, one district is one district, right? And one district does not make a trend. I imagine, look, thank you for all nodding at that. Appreciate it so much. And so what I would say is this is not for us to, one person testifying is not the why a district might spend a lot or spend a little. It's for us to make sure that we have sort of realities to test our theories against later, not to form theories. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So the lineup. Saoirse, I have 2 lists that are identical.
Oh, yeah, that's that. I just printed one.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, Cheryl, do you want to start us off? And then we'll go to Ted and then Jacob and then wrap up with Elizabeth. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thanks for hearing my testimony. And I hope when I'm done, please feel free if I haven't exactly answered the question you're trying to get at. I'm sure you'll follow up and I can provide more information. So yes, my name is Cheryl Scarzello. I am the Director of Finance for Slate Valley Unified School District. We're located in Fairhaven. This is my 18th year as a school business official. I've served on many VASBO committees, and I'm actually also currently one of the 3 Vermont School Boards Association appointees to the VHI Board of Directors. So Slate Valley, which is on the border of New York State, is made up of 6 towns. 5 towns are in Rutland County: Fairhaven, Castleton, Hubbardton, West Haven, and Benson. And 1 town, Orwell, is in Addison County. In 2019, what was formerly the Addison Rutland Supervisory Union merged to become Slate Valley Unified Union School District. This was under Act 46. At the time, the district was made up of 4 elementary schools serving pre-K through grade 8, 1 middle school serving grades 6 through 8, and 1 high school serving grades 9 through 12. So the merger of Addison Rutland Supervisory Union provided our district with a great opportunity to evaluate how we could operate in the most efficient manner possible. When we merged in 2019, we centralized as many district operations as possible, creating a more efficient organization and reducing redundant positions. And that's a big part of our story, is that we worked very hard at that when we merged. And I think that has really paid off for us in the long run. In July of 22, in an effort to further consolidate, the middle school in Castleton was closed and sold back to the town of Castleton. The elementary schools in Orwell, Benson, Castleton, and Fairhaven were reorganized and became pre-K through 6 schools. And the district chose to use, it's also important to note that the district chose to use the majority of the ESSER funds that we received to reconfigure the existing high school in Fairhaven. And by doing that, we were able to bring all the 7th and 8th grade students throughout the district onto the high school campus, thus creating the Fairhaven Union Middle High School, serving grades 7 through 12. So again, looking at an opportunity to centralize and consolidate our operation. In 2019, the district's enrollment was approximately 1,300 students. This year, enrollment has declined to about 1,170 students, representing a 10% decrease over 8 years. Currently, 44 of our students are accessing vocational education programs in Rutland at the Stafford Technical Center. And 4 students are enrolled at the Hannaford Career Center in Middlebury. And with the Vermont State University's Castleton campus located within the district, we have 15 students taking advantage of the early college program and 3 the dual enrollment program. So over the last 8 years, basically since we merged, the district has reduced staffing by 45 positions, including 3 administrative roles. For the FY27 budget, we are making reductions of nearly 13 positions across the district. And this is in a combination of areas. In FY26, Slate Valley's education spending per long-term weighted average daily membership was $11,565, which is more than $2,300 below the state average. This placed Slate Valley as the 12th lowest spending in the state. Many of our neighboring districts in Rutland County also spend below the state average. Conversely, our neighbors in Addison County spend nearly $3,500 more per student than Slate Valley. Slate Valley is consistently one of the lowest spending districts in the state. Despite being a low spending district, Slate Valley continues to demonstrate a strong return on investment when viewed alongside regional spending and achievement data. Slate Valley student performance on the spring 2025 BCAP shows competitive and in several cases above average outcomes across grades and content areas. Notably, the district ranks first or second regionally in multiple grade level English and math comparisons. This indicates that Slate Valley is converting fewer financial resources into strong academic results, outperforming or matching districts with significantly higher spending levels. Overall, the data suggests that Slate Valley's instructional system, staffing models, and targeted supports are yielding high academic returns per dollar invested, reflecting efficient use of funds and effective educational practices relative to our regional peers. Given this low spending and above average student outcomes, one might expect taxpayers to readily approve the district's budgets each March. In fact, our budget has been voted on 16 times over the last 8 years. In only 4 of those 8 years did the budget pass in March, and it took 5 votes to pass the budget in FY25, with final approval occurring in June of 2024. Typically, the higher spending districts to our north pass their budgets on their first vote. Notably, the FY25 budget reflected the first year of new student weighting under Act 27, from which Slate Valley significantly benefited. Despite the district's effort to communicate this benefit, voters continued to reject the budget, which we believe was largely influenced by messaging at the state level regarding school district spending statewide. In early January, we worked with our finance committee to make final decisions regarding the FY27 budget so that the ballot warning could be signed at the board meeting on January 26th. The FY27 budget reflects an increase of 2.8%, resulting in a 3.48% increase in education spending per LTW ADM. And that 3.48%, that's the percentage that will appear on our ballot warning. Last year, that percentage was 3.61%, and that was on our second vote. So we're not sure how that 3.48 will play out. Historically, our budget gets voted down. We are unable to provide taxpayers with their actual school tax rate, which is ultimately what they most want to know. While we share extensive information each year about increases and decreases in the budget, we are only able to provide tax rate estimates at the time the budget is first voted on in March because the yield has not been set. Without the final yield being passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, we can only provide estimates. This uncertainty is understandably frustrating for voters, and we believe it contributes to the repeated rejection of our budget. Taxpayers are being asked to approve a budget without knowing the ultimate impact on their tax bills, and it is easy to understand why that creates frustration. We are very careful in all our budget communications to emphasize that tax rates are estimates because the yield has not been set. However, I would say that most taxpayers have no idea what that actually means when we say the yield has not been set. They don't really understand why that results in us not being able to give them a tax rate. In order to develop tax rate estimates, I use the yield provided in the December 1st letter from the state tax commissioner. At the time the warning must be signed, this is usually the only yield available. In 4 of the last 5 years, the final yield as enacted has been higher than the yield included in the December 1st letter. There have been years based on information presented to the legislature by JFO that I have adjusted the yield assumption. However, this is typically only occurs in years when we have multiple budget votes. In only 2 years has the yield been set by the time of our final budget vote, and only in those instances have I been able to provide tax rates with certainty. I believe it is reasonable for taxpayers to know what their tax rate will be at the time they are asked to vote on their school budget. Education funding in the state of Vermont is complicated, and trying to understand it is enough to make your head spin even after dealing with it for 18 years. I fully understand the frustration of our taxpayers when at the end of a lengthy budget presentation, we have to say that we can only estimate the change in their school tax rate because the yield has not been set. Thank you for your time and for listening to me this afternoon, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions you might have.
Thank you, Cheryl. I would also love for people to know what their tax rates are in advance. That would be lovely. I think we're gonna wait to do questions until everyone has spoken. If that's okay with you. If you need to leave sooner than that, then we can also, okay. And also please feel free to anyone is welcome to turn off their camera if they're not testifying, if that just feels more comfortable for you. So next up we have Ted. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
We can, thank you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to provide public comment before your committee this afternoon. My name is Ted Plemenis. I'm the business manager and chief financial officer for Rutland City Public Schools. I've served the school district as its business manager for 5 years. At the committee's request, I'm glad to share several observations about the district's budget process, how the homestead property dollar equivalent yield affects our budget process and the district, the impact of the annual December 1 letter from the Department of Taxes, which conveys a preliminary yield estimate, and how the legislature's yield bill each spring impacts budgeting and voting at the district level. Last week, the Rutland City Public Schools Board of School Commissioners approved a district budget of $69.8 million for fiscal year 27, which would be a 3.9% increase in total expenditures. If approved by voters in March, this budget would result in per pupil education spending of $12,666 for fiscal 27. That per pupil education spending would be about 10% below one projection of the median for Vermont public schools next year. In regard to the homestead property dollar equivalent yield, that yield has a substantial impact on homestead property tax rates at the local level, as you know. Let me share an example. The tax letter that was issued last month estimated a preliminary yield for fiscal year 27 that is 3% higher than this year's yield, increasing to a projected $8,849. If that preliminary yield had been applied for this current year, then the homestead property tax rate for Rutland City Public Schools would have been 5 cents lower at $1.55 versus our actual rate of about $1.60. My colleagues and I pay attention to the preliminary yield when it's issued each December and to its possible implications for the coming year's homestead property tax rate. That's part of a process, obviously, to prepare a budget that reflects a cost structure which is reasonable and responsible for the current year and which is sustainable for the long term. However, our school district does not develop its annual budget based on an estimated or projected property tax rate. Like many districts, we spend several months each fall and winter working with school principals, with other administrative leaders, and meeting with the finance committee of our school board to develop a budget from the ground up. Each budget reflects staffing levels and other resources that will be needed to operate our educational programs for the coming year. And each year's educational programs are designed to achieve goals that have been detailed in the district's 5-year strategic plan. When reflecting upon that latter aspect of budgeting, being based on a multi-year strategic plan, it's easier to appreciate how important it is for school districts to be able to anticipate with continuity and consistency the forthcoming local, state, and federal funding. We know, of course, that the preliminary yield estimate issued each December is subject to change, and that it will not become final until enacted by the legislature the following spring. For these and other reasons, Rutland City Public Schools typically refrains from offering projections of a homestead property tax rate during our budget reviews. At most, we might refer to a range of possible property tax rates, depending upon possible outcomes of the yield legislation. All that we know about such early projections is they're likely to be inaccurate until the yield bill is enacted. It might be fair to suggest that if there could be a way to provide more clarity about the eventual official property dollar equivalent yield sooner in the budget and voting process, then some anticipatory concerns might be reduced. And perhaps with more clarity earlier in the process, then budgeting and communications could be more efficient and to the point. An option to consider might be for the Department of Taxes to offer early assurance that the forthcoming year's homestead property dollar equivalent yield will be set at least a minimum level that is determined or selected each December, and which could possibly be increased later in the spring before being enacted if state finances allow. As the state's overall budget process progresses during the year, then the legislature could deal with any ensuing budgetary impacts at the state level. And as my colleague Cheryl Scarzello observed a few minutes ago, if you look back over the last 5 years, 4 times out of those 5 years, the ultimate yield ended up higher than the preliminary estimate. Before I conclude my remarks, I'd also like to comment on that earlier point about the importance for district budgeting of being able to anticipate continuity and consistency in funding, and how that relates to conversations about implementing a new foundation formula, which might replace current funding mechanics based upon Act 127's pupil weighting and cost factors. Rutland City Public Schools is, of course, open to a foundation formula conversation. Our administration believes, however, that any new plan for a foundation formula should only move forward with full district-level modeling also being provided. A school district cannot evaluate a new proposal and its potential results without first seeing the numbers. In that regard, Rutland City Public Schools and I greatly appreciate the leadership that Representative Kornheiser and the legislature provided a few years ago in implementing Act 127. Legislators who participated on the former task force on the implementation of pupil weighting factors were particularly effective in advancing a data-driven policy that created more accurate and a more sustainable way of funding school districts. These legislators proved once again that sound, data-driven policy can be achieved. That concludes my remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I would be glad to answer any questions after the other presentations have concluded.
Thank you. And thanks for the personal shout out there. I appreciate it, Ted.
It's
Jacob,
well-deserved.
you're up.
Thank you.
Jacob, do you want to share your testimony? Thanks for being
Sure.
here.
Thank you. So I'm Jacob Vazina. I'm the Director of Finance for Hartford School District. I come before you today to share testimony regarding the process of our FY27 budget for the Hartford School District and the impact on the yields. In my 7 years of school business administration, this budget has been the most challenging. We're in an interesting position in that we have a career and technical center and 2 special education collaboratives. When we're talking about the impact of budgeting, we're seeing it from many different perspectives. We were in a good position with FY26 when we finally got our reappraisals done, so our CLA with the state adjustment reached an all-time high. Last year's yields with the buy down led to a decrease in the FY26 homestead tax rate. We ended up with an enormous homestead tax rate decrease of 39%. There have been a number of challenges that have impacted the budgeting process for FY27. There still remains plenty of uncertainty on the path forward. With current timeline of Act 73 set to go into effect FY29, it's impossible to know what we should be planning for. Our 3 negotiated agreements, professional staff, support staff, and administrators expire at the end of FY26 and are up for renewal. Where we ended up settling on salary increases was a little bit higher than what I had initially budgeted in October. Health insurance rates continue to be a significant financial burden on our budget in Hartford. Our dental rates are going up 12% for FY27. Another challenge was getting an accurate long-term weighted average number. Our number changed quite a few times and wasn't finalized until January 5th. It's concerning to me that we cannot seem to accurately count Vermont students. That piece of data is crucial in developing our budget. Additionally, facility needs from deferred maintenance continues to be a growing issue in the budget. In FY25, we reduced around $2.5 million from our budget to try and bring tax rates down. That year, while a large number of budgets did not pass, we were able to pass both the budget and our $21 million facilities bond to address a number of deferred maintenance issues. Our approach to the budget has been to arrive at a level service. As we navigate Act 73, we've tried to be very careful about not adding new positions. We're working through our staff to student ratios to be compliant with Section 6 of Act 73 and to explore innovative ways to strategically use the staff we already have in the district. This is the first year that we've been fully staffed at the administrative level, and we are trying to stabilize our levels across the district. We have done our best to shuffle the deck chairs and continue to discuss how best to use the resources we have available. With the exclusion of our debt service, we fall below the excess spending threshold. We have no interest in going over the excess spending threshold as stewards of our community resources and on behalf of our taxpayers. We know that there are some surrounding districts to us that are over the excess spending threshold for FY27. As part of our budget, we are applying $1.7 million of surplus to buy down taxes and remain within the allowable per pupil spending threshold that the state has set. Our approach to the budget each year has been to strive to find a balance between moving Hartford forward, realizing our vision and the mission work necessary to get us there, and trying to keep things affordable for our community. As the years have gone on, this has proven to be more of a challenge. Each administrator has their wish list of human and material resources that they would like to add to the budget, but we've been very cautious and have managed expectations throughout the last several years to avoid having to pivot and significantly reduce the budget without careful and thoughtful planning. When we received the December 1 letter with the draft of the yields, it gives us a better idea about what tax rates are looking like. It gives us a chance to make some adjustments if we need to, since we also get a draft of the CLA now as well. In developing the budget, I am basing my numbers on the December 1st letter yields. As I always tell my taxpayers, each version of the budget is a snapshot in time based on the current information we have available. I know going into town meeting day that the yields are not going to be final. I want to be as transparent as I can be about what the numbers are looking like so people can make an informed decision. The future of budgeting is only going to get more difficult. The cost to educate and care for our students has gone up over the last few years. The needs of our students have increased post-COVID-19. It's difficult to see the future of budgeting with so much in the air as far as the path forward. I think school education funding reform does need to happen, but it should be a measured and calculated approach with collaboration from those in the field. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, I want to use some finish out the game hockey term, but I don't have one. So whatever that would be, that's what I just said to you.
All right, sounds good. And so my testimony is not specific to the particular district that I am in. I'm just coming as a member, as the president of VASBO, to share kind of just an overall trend. I'm hearing a lot of familiar things from my colleagues in their testimony. I want to thank you for allowing us the opportunity to be here today. As members of Vermont Association of School Business Officials, we are officials from across the state in varying different portions of the state. We are all working towards the same goal. We're preparing our budgets that will be approved by our boards, published into annual reports, and ultimately voted upon by our communities. This year's budget development process has been characterized by strong commitments to balancing the needs of students with the long-term sustainability for taxpayers in mind. School district boards and officials engage deeply in the budget process well before the December 1st letter is issued, which provides the estimated homestead property yield. At the outset of our budget development, boards work closely with district leadership to establish priorities. Chief among these priorities is the preservation of educational opportunities and continued investment in high-quality learning for our students. Achieving these goals while meeting the established financial constraints is an ongoing challenge. Common financial targets set by boards during our process typically include a percentage growth in the expenditure budget itself, percentage growth in the total education spending, remaining below the long-term weighted cost per pupil threshold, and a percentage growth in union-wide or individual town tax rates. School district officials work diligently to meet these board established targets. However, prior to the arrival of the December 1st letter, a significant unknown remains how these collective efforts will ultimately affect our local tax rates. Once the letter is received, districts can better estimate tax implications, although it's widely understood that the yield is not finalized until the yield bill is passed by the legislature. For fiscal year 26-27, the yield was set in the December 1st letter at $8,849, which is an increase of $253 from the prior fiscal year. Districts have used this estimate to refine their budgets with closer attention to projecting tax impacts while continuing to prioritize their educational quality. This work occurs with the understanding that changes resulted from the yield bill could significantly alter the tax implications of budgets that have already been approved by boards, warned, and presented to their voters. At this point in the budget cycle, most districts with a March vote have already received board approval for their budgets, and they're in the process of warning and publishing them for their communities. During this period, districts closely monitor legislative communications for any indication that the yield may change, remaining prepared to pivot if possible prior to final publication and warning. Once budgets are warned and published, districts have limited ability to respond to any yield changes, whether the yield shifts higher or lower. The only option available is to communicate updated information to our voters as quickly and clearly as possible. While a higher than estimated yield is generally beneficial for taxpayers, even positive changes can create uncertainty or confusion among our voters. Vermont's education finance system is complex, and despite extensive efforts to provide caveats and explanations, changes to previously presented information can lead to questions about our transparency and our accuracy. And the last part of my testimony, I just want to talk a little bit about the current state of the district budgets overall for fiscal year 26-27, just from a perspective of what I know. The executive team of VASBO, we collect district budget data through a shared spreadsheet that allows our members to voluntarily enter information on their current budget drafts. It's a living document. The data collected includes things like the budget status for their particular budgets, the percentage increases or decreases in total education spending, long-term weighted average daily membership counts, education spending per long-term weighted pupil, and the estimated district or town tax rates. Members are encouraged to update their information as their drafts evolve and to include as little or as much as they feel comfortable doing. This data is used internally by our group for trend analysis, but it has very important limitations. The first thing is participation is completely voluntary. Not all districts are represented or regularly updating their information. The data reflects draft budgets that have not been voted on by the electorate, and they remain subject to change, particularly in the response to adjustments to the homestead property yield. In the near future, districts will be submitting our preliminary budget information to the Agency of Education, We believe this will provide more comprehensive and standardized data set for statewide analysis. With those caveats in mind, the internal data that we currently have from the members who have updated their information is showing the following averages. Overall education spending growth is showing at 3.3% increase. Long-term weighted average daily membership is declining at 1.74%. Education spending per long-term weighted pupil growth is increasing by 2.89% overall. The average lowest post-CLA estimated tax rate growth is at 3.84% increase, and the average highest post-CLA estimated tax rate growth is at 10.36%. It's important to note that these averages are generic. They're simple in the sense that they include both large and small districts across the state and supervisory unions. This means that the percentage increase of a larger district equates to a more substantial dollar amount, and yet when averaging a percentage increase, they're averaged in the same as a smaller district. So this could skew the information higher or lower depending on how many districts of each size and scale have been included in our data. We appreciate the legislature's interest in school district fiscal year 26-27 budgets and the impact of the homestead property yield on those budgets. We hope this testimony assists the committee as it works toward passing a yield bill that reflects the district's good faith efforts to be responsible stewards of education funds while also providing meaningful relief to our taxpayers. We thank you for your time and consideration. And the only thing I would add to this before questions is in regards to specific to go back to the district I'm currently working in. I think there's a good example of how this can all play out. When we talk about overall education spending growth, my current district has approved a budget that's going to be warned and presented to voters that only has expenditures growing by 3.4%. And yet the overall education spending growth is more like 6.6. Once we factor in our long-term weighted average daily membership number, which declined substantially this year, we are looking at 8.5% increase in long-term weighted per pupil education spending. So just to give an idea of how that can all play out in one budget cycle, and then when you project that down to a tax rate for our taxpayers post-CLA, we're looking at about 8.5. It's almost identical to our increase that we're seeing in our long-term weighted per pupil growth. But the primary reason for that this year for South Burlington is because of the decline in our long-term weighted pupil numbers. So just to kind of give that as an example too, we typically here we're in the higher spending range, but not close to the threshold. Just to also give that as an example.
Thank you. And you said that you that you work for South Burlington?
I do, yes.
Thank you. It's just not listed because you were here as a VASBO representative. It's not listed on the agenda. And I just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware of that. Thank you.
Yes.
I think I get boring in my appreciation of the School Business Managers Association, but I think of you all as just the most incredible partners to this committee as we do our work. And I'm so grateful for the careful way you develop your budgets with your school boards and your school administrators and how you communicate about it with us. One thing that we've been exploring this year and in many past years is JFO, I don't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, did a lot of statistical analysis on district spending and what it could possibly be correlated to, and really went through a lot of different scenarios, student need and size of district and income of district and grand list of district and just like so many things that you could imagine. And none of them were correlated to anything. And so I'm hesitant to ask this, but I think it's an important question from your perspective as people who are very, very carefully developing district budgets to meet student needs in your district with a lot of the same, costs from district to district. I'm curious why you think you have so much variability between districts. Because, and I'll just put, I don't want to sort of keep my internal punchline a secret because there's no need. So in my understanding, the only thing it does correlate with is how much was spent the prior year.
Yeah, I'll start, and if anybody else on the group has anything to add or refute, that's fine. But basically, in my history, I've not been at South Burlington very long, so I've been in other districts, particularly Addison County. And from my experience, I recall a day when I first started being in a district finance office and creating budgets where they used to, in some districts, take their prior year budget, roll it forward and say, what will this cost us in the new year? And then start from that, whether that's making cuts or making increases in any particular year based on needs. That's not a from the ground up type of budgeting process. However, that was the first few years of being a business manager and director of finance that I experienced that with a board. And now it seems like in the past 5 or 6 years, that has transitioned to basically taking the floor out of it and starting from the bottom and building it from the ground up and trying to determine these are the kids we have this year. This is the student needs we have. These are the buildings we have. How much do we need to generate in order to give high quality programming to our students and population and not cut opportunities for them? That's usually one of the goals. And what I see from that is oftentimes conversations, even within a school district, amongst board members, administration, even teachers and those out in the schools. I think they got accustomed to the old way of building budgets in some cases. And so they feel like even when you come to them and say, well, it's only going to cost this year, if that is $500,000 less than it cost last year, and I'm talking $500,000 less than what they actually spent, they feel like that's a cut. And they also feel like it's a cut if it's just a decrease from the prior year budget in any particular area, even if it was something that they didn't previously end up needing or spending. So there is kind of this like training and retraining that's happening in the school districts, between the administration, the boards, trying to retrain that mentality that we need to basically understand what it is the needs are and that those needs change every year. It might not be the same things you need. It may still cost the same amount of money, but at the end of the day, you're not just building your budget to basically tailor how much the total cost is going to be. You're trying to really determine what exactly is it that you need to spend your money on. And so I think there has been a transition in the last 5 years, and I'm not really sure what has completely driven that other than folks just trying to be better stewards of the money and better understand what kind of funding we need to be able to provide the education.
Thank you. And for sort of shared transparency, generally the legislature works with the general fund in that same way that you used to do things, just looking at the ups and downs and not really sort of taking it apart and putting it back together. And this year, our appropriations committee is really trying to get to the ground floor of the budget in order to understand something beyond those ups and downs. So I'm glad we're all in this together. Does anyone else want to answer that question that I asked?
Yeah, I can share a little bit. I mean, you know,
Oh,
I think we lost Cheryl a little
I
bit
do
there.
think, yeah. Anyone else?
She's frozen.
I'm willing to say something.
Thank you.
Kind of like with what Elizabeth was saying, in my earlier years of budgeting, I know when I was meeting with a lot of principals, it was a lot of like, hey, give me what you gave me last year and I'll, still continue on with it. Now that we've gotten new leadership and everything, and we have our vision of a graduate, we're starting to work towards our new goals and everything of, what do you need to get there and how do you want to get there and use your kind of dollars and resources more efficiently now. So I think it's, again, kind of that retraining of not just, yeah, give me what you gave me last year and I'll make do with it. But, what's the path forward here? What's your plan? What's your vision?
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
I would echo what both Elizabeth and Jacob have said, and hopefully Cheryl, if we get her back. Our district, like others, has put a lot of emphasis in recent years on developing a fairly rigorous strategic plan so that we avoid a scenario, that the typical scenario of ready, shoot, aim. Well, now we've spent and invested many years to say, okay, what has to happen educationally and what are the needs of the student? Because as Elizabeth pointed out, I think any attempt to model or analytically evaluate, as JFO has tried to do, is going to run into the challenge of the student mix, and the student needs can change dramatically from year to year. So as Jacob was describing, we're building it up every year, but doing so with the guidance of our strategic plan. I think part of that is just improved process, and I think part of it is a response to the continuing challenges to do more with less. I think that's probably brought about additional fiscal discipline and focus vis-a-vis the model that Elizabeth described before. So those are all good changes, and I see more potential benefits from that coming in the coming years.
I appreciate that. It's interesting that you all have similar answers, given that, say, like Jacob and Ted, you are from districts that spend such significantly different amounts of money, but might be very similar in terms of student demographics and even sort of your municipal makeup. Cheryl, we lost you for a minute. Do you want to jump in, or should we? We were just wrapping up that question, so it's perfect timing for you.
Well,
I'm not.
Oh, there, you're back.
You're back. Hi.
back. Sorry.
Don't turn your head.
I apologize.
I don't think it's your fault.
I was just going to point out, as I testified, in the last 8 years, we voted on our budget 16 times. We do have to be very aware of what that increase is from year to year, and very aware of what that percent increase is on our budget. I don't have a bond. I have a bond, I think was a 20 or 25-year bond. It's going to be retiring in the next 2 years. So we try to include in our general fund what we can in order to maintain our buildings. When we do have surplus, we'll use our surplus to try to keep up with our maintenance. As Elizabeth explained, we build our budget from the bottom up. We look at the number of students in each school, and we adjust from year to year staff and other resources that are needed in each school. We don't roll anything forward. And I do think in terms of centralization, that is something we've worked extremely hard at, is looking at how do we continue to use the resources that we have. And being a school district really gives us a great opportunity to look at staff, how they can be used across buildings.
I don't want to interrupt, but I'm going to. When you say being a school district, you mean being a school district rather than a supervisory union allows you to do those things?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry,
Being a
continue on.
unified school district. I really think that when we merged, we really started focusing on that. And as I said, I think that has really helped us a great deal. And also helped us as we're seeing declining enrollment, continuing to look at, okay, what does that mean in terms of resources and how can we use them across the district with things shifting in terms of numbers of students and buildings and things like that.
Thank you. Representative Brannigan, you had a question quite a while ago. Do you still have that question?
I can't remember what it was.
That's reasonable, given that I jumped in front of you.
But very good presentations. I want to thank all of them they obviously spent a lot of time preparing for us, and I really appreciate it.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I have so many questions, but I will try to keep it. My first question is, I think we know how Ted feels about Act 127, but I wanted to see if any of you could provide a little more color on the impact of Act 127 in your district. I think it was intended to provide more tax capacity to districts that were lower spending. But it sounds like basically lower spending districts have kind of stayed lower spending districts, even with that additional tax capacity. And then Elizabeth, for you, this is a question I've asked a couple of times at specifically at South Burlington School Board meetings. How much of the decline in long-term weighted average daily membership is actual students leaving the district, and how much of it is a change in weights as a result of the Act 127 phase in South Burlington? So I don't know if you want me to specify who just.
I think Cheryl's gonna.
Maybe Cheryl with the first part of that question.
Yeah,
Write
I
down
would,
your
you know, sometimes I think we said we were this poster child for Act 127. I mean, we really benefited from that change in weighting, and we really saw that as a district when we were building the budget and thinking, okay, this is a great opportunity for us to maybe build back in some places where we have had to decrease sometimes in order to get our budget passed. But that was the year that it took us 5 votes to pass our budget. And you would have thought that that year our budget would have passed easily, but it didn't. It was the most since we've merged 5 times. We finally passed it in June. And as a result, unfortunately, a lot of the benefit that we would have received as a result of that change in weighting ultimately end up going back to the taxpayers, because we had to continue to reduce our budget in order to get it passed. And I think a lot of that there was so much information swirling around about Act 127. I think we were really being impacted by what our taxpayers were hearing at the state level. And that's something we have to really carefully deal with when we're presenting our budget, is saying we're a low spending district. And I have a chart where I show them graphically where we are compared to others. Because the taxpayers are hearing a lot of the other things that are going on in the state and the increases statewide. And we have to continually dial that back and say, but that's not the story here at Slate Valley, and try to present that information when we go through our budget presentation.
May I jump in to add a point of clarification?
Yeah.
I just want to add a little bit of context, if possible, to the observation that perhaps some low spending districts have stayed low spending districts. And I haven't looked at the data rigorously, but it's worth pointing out that there have only been 2 budgets approved and implemented so far under Act 27. It went into effect for fiscal 25. It was in effect for 26. And now we're in the process of approving the 3rd budget under 127. And so the only point that I would make is that it's still relatively new. Adjustments take time. It's not like you turn on a dime with these school budgets, to my point earlier about the long-term impacts and the need for continuity. And just to offer a couple of examples, because I think it's a very important concern that was raised about, well, Act 127 provided additional taxing capacity, and maybe they're not using it, and maybe that's not having the intended effect. So let me just give you a couple of brief examples in Rutland City. The fact that this has benefited our district and given us additional flexibility that we didn't have before. So in our 27 budget, for example, we're using some of that ability to expand teaching resources in 27 that will address student learning gaps. We're making other investments in 27 in literacy. We're dedicating attention to exploring additional early childhood learning opportunities. We're providing more access to physical education. And one of the pillars of our strategic plan is to build family and community engagement. So we're offering transportation to some school events for families in need. So, I could give you many other examples, but I just want to offer that as the point that please don't come away with the impression that the benefits from 27 are not being used in a very targeted and important way to help us improve educational experience, because it is, and it has made a huge difference for us, and we greatly appreciate that.
Would anyone else like to add anything to answer that question?
The only part I had was the secondary part of the question in regards to South Burlington and enrollment and long-term weighted ADM. I've only been here in this district since July, so I'm not even a full year into being in South Burlington. But what I discovered when I got here was, as they were trying to evaluate their student counts against what the Agency of Education was giving us for numbers and counts, I went in and basically tried to recreate the counts using the Agency of Education's data spreadsheets myself to see where the changes were. And from what I can see, if you look back to, I think, fiscal year 20, somewhere around COVID, there was kind of an increase in some population, some more students moving into this area. It looks like they invested in putting in some ZEMS buildings, basically so that they could house all the incoming students and have adequate learning spaces for them. And then since that time, there was a little bubble of like maybe a year or two. And since that time, it's now declining in the enrollment again. So it was a brief bubble of time. And now the enrollment is declining over time. The other thing I saw is it looks like it first started for you in this district last year when you were building your FY26, because the number is a long-term, meaning 2-year weighted average count. Sometimes when you have a decline in enrollment, it takes a full 2 years for it to really hit you in your budget process. Because it'll be a slight decline in the first year, and then you've got 2 low years averaging together in the second year. And so that's when you really see the drop. So if I look at this year, I would say about 35 FTE of the drop is actual declining enrollment. And the remainder of the drop that I saw is all in weighting. And that weighting, primarily from what I can see in this district, is the poverty rating and the free and reduced lunch going down pretty substantially for this district this year.
Quick clarification, Elizabeth, you said poverty, free and reduced lunch went down significantly between last year and this year for your district? Okay. Thank you. There's some interesting things about how the numbers statewide don't seem to have got, so you all know that. We're just so you know, like we are digging into it both in the background and we'll soon dig into it in the foreground.
Well, and we did, we did kind of really push for, accurate information. I am appreciative of how the Agency of Education, I think they were really proactive about working with districts this year and really trying to solidify the accuracy of the information that was coming from our student data systems, our data managers to the state. And then they were kicking that information back out to us on a regular basis and giving us lots of feedback and ability to have conversations about that to make sure it was accurate. So I appreciate that. I feel like that's been an improvement since past years.
Thank you. Representative Wozniak and then Maslin.
Thank you. So first of all, Cheryl, I appreciate you pointing out the dynamic of that the increased tax capacity does not necessarily translate into voter approved budgets. I'm from Barrie, so that's a story that I know very well. So it's reassuring to know that we're not alone. Actual question is, when talking about the December 1 letter, and what I call shorthand, the timeline issue of y'all are building budgets based off of a number that comes out December 1st that typically changes over the course of the legislative session. I think that's a really important dysfunction to name of our current education system. I'm curious if you all have other thoughts about ways in which the rollout of the December 1 letter or the information in the December 1 letter, et cetera, changes that could be made to that process that would be helpful for you.
And I'm going to pause before you answer and just make a public service announcement for anyone who's not aware. In Act 73, we moved so that all of the tax rates would be available sort of a year out of budgeting so that everyone would have that brilliant transparency. Okay, over to you all in whatever order. See you. Or not.
So I think part of what happens for us with the December 1 letter is that when it comes out, there are lots of broad generalizations that start getting made about what's happening in school districts. And I think we often have to sort of fight against that in order to get through to our voters about what's actually happening here. And I mean, we do an extensive amount of communication and on a lot of different fronts, but I think that when that comes out, it's really hard for us to get on top of it, for lack of a better word, to get the information out about what's happening here. And also, when it comes out, we may not be far enough along that we really want to start putting information out there. We're still working through, you know, what is the impact of different things? Where can we still make some adjustments? So we're not eager necessarily to put a number out too soon, because again, if it changes in response to newer information, primarily this year, it's been the long-term weighted ADM. We were way down, but then we came back up, so that was helpful. So that's, I think, what happens when the December 1st letter comes out. There's so much that's said about what is going on in schools, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't translate across the state. So that's a challenge I think that's a challenge for lower spending districts. And maybe that's why we have such a hard time passing our budget, because there is so much other information out there.
Thank you.
I think there's also a challenge in that a lot of times at the very beginning, before the December 1st letter comes out, the Agency of Ed comes and asks our collective group where we're seeing our budgets coming in. And that is so early in the stage of our budget process. As Cheryl indicated, many of us aren't ready to be giving any kind of generalized numbers that really are meaningful. Especially, it's kind of like which came first, the chicken or the egg. You know, you don't necessarily know whether that December 1 letter is going to be driven off of, and the yield will be set driven off of the information that we are fueling it with. And if we've given an inaccurate number, because then later into our budget process, we determine that our budget is going to be completely different than what we've projected or thought in our first or second draft, that could drastically change and change what they decide ultimately to put into the yield, even whatever, you know, if it's completely different than when the December letter was published. So it's really rather hard to talk about our budgets in that early of a stage, but yet I also feel like if we don't, we're not helping inform the state in how to set that December 1 letter, because my understanding is that there is a substantial portion of that is based upon school district spending.
Very much so. Thank you. And thanks for all the collaboration. Representative Maslin, I think you had the.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. A couple of different things, different directions. Ted, I commend you for using transportation money to build community involvement with your education. I think that's really admirable. Some people wouldn't think of that, but it turns out that it's very, very important. And generally speaking, Elizabeth and others providing us, you know, I guess say on the ground impact of weights. I mean, we deal with that on a district-wide basis or statewide basis, and it's very helpful to hear your your on the ground analysis of how it affects your school district, because whether we want to admit it or not, and we have to because our taxpayers require it, we realize the impacts district by district are actually sometimes very different. And we need to be cognizant of that when we do our policy work. It's first do no harm. And so we have to pay attention closer than some of us would, I think, particularly within the building and a broad area. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Very welcome.
And I agree with Ted. I mean, as a district, we were very frustrated that it took us 5 times to pass the budget that year. Because I do think overall, it has benefited us as a district. I think if it was not for that and the change in the weights, we'd probably be in a really difficult situation in terms of our expectation of our taxpayers relative to what it's costing us in our district.
Thanks. Representative Bodie.
So
And we're going to go for another 15 minutes, folks.
I wonder if the letter, the December 1 letter, you ever think, I prefer that this letter would include this or not include that? I would wish that this letter would come out at a different time, or whatever. Timing, content, wording, would you wish for a historical look back, like in the past years, X was predicted to be the increase, just this year, 11.9%. And in the past, the legislature decreased that amount to half that amount. And if they do the same thing this year, you can expect that increase to be half what it is in the letter. I mean, maybe not even having that 11.9 be the number. What would you think of some creative ways to make that letter not be something that is so difficult to overcome the rhetoric?
And I just, Representative Wozniak was the person who started walking us down this road, not you, Representative Bodie, but I did not ask any of you to prepare answers to that question today, so I just want to sort of name that. You were here to sort of talk about why high or low spending might be high or low. You're welcome to answer it, but please don't. You're also welcome to come back when we have the letter as sort of our topic of conversation.
That's fine.
Sorry about that.
Oh,
I think the biggest challenge for us is, just as I was trying to articulate, is that I think that the December letter being set is based, partly on our district budget spending. And we are projecting and giving information when we're not really ready to give it. So if that's the information they need in order to be able to set that yield, that's challenging because we're not ready with our numbers at that time either. If you were to push it to later in the year when we're giving that information and the letter comes out later, then we're up against district budgets being voted on without even having any estimate of a yield. So I don't know that any of us could really answer that unless we find a way to set a different criteria for that number being set.
May
So
I,
here you-
may I,
it's the-
may I
Go ahead.
amplify?
Yeah,
May I
absolutely.
amplify what Elizabeth just said? So even though it wasn't on the agenda, of course, this letter's and its nature and its scope is such a key issue. And I do believe your committee could be well served by taking that up in a little bit more detail on a subsequent occasion. But just for this afternoon, if you think about it, that letter is a statutory requirement, and it's a very challenging requirement to fulfill for all the reasons that have been mentioned before. I think in order to make meaningful and sustainable changes in that, we all need to step back for a moment and sort of look at it from a process standpoint. As Elizabeth was alluding to, for example, some of the input that we provide is very preliminary. Maybe we should do a better job of providing more information up front. Maybe working with legislators such as yourselves, we could look at a timeline and say, okay, realistically, what might be possible to change and what would make sense? But let me just offer just from a simple standpoint, one of the most interesting aspects of that letter to me. And that is, of course, if we look at the December 1st letter from last month, one of the key headlines was average property taxes will go up by 12%. And that's on the front page of the letter. And of course, all of the media grabs onto that immediately. So that's what people see. And very few people actually have the time or perhaps the interest to read the 3 to 4 pages that constitute the letter. But if you do, and you go back all the way to page 3, you'll see that the letter includes a very specific reference to point out that the 12% is just an average across the state. And an average may not at all be representative of individual school districts. And in fact, it's typically not, because there's a wide range of district results. In a year in which, recently, I think it was a year ago, the letter forecasted a 5.9% increase in property taxes in Rutland City Public Schools. It went down. So it was just a different direction. But that's the nature of an average. So maybe we need to step back and think about what we are required to communicate and then how we communicate it. But just as an anecdote, I have to tell you the impact of that messaging up front, as several people have alluded to, is very, very powerful because, back a couple of years ago, when it was advertised that the average property tax rate would go up by 18.5%, of course, it ended up by going up a little bit less than that, but it was still too much. The night before our town meeting day in our required information session, I had a resident from Rutland City Public Schools walk into that information session at the beginning of March asking me, why are my taxes going up by 18.5% next year? And of course, I looked at him and I asked, are you a resident of Rutland City? And he said, yes. And I said, well, based on the metrics we have, that was an average for the state. Your taxes are not going to go up by any more than a third of that or perhaps less. But of course, what was seared into his mind was the 18.5%. And once that's out there and repeated in the media, which is beyond your control, unless we can control somehow the messaging and the communication up front in a simpler way, then as Cheryl said, we're sort of behind from the beginning and trying to catch up and provide information, some of which people will hear and some of which they won't. So it's a very complex issue that we're dealing with, and I do think it's worth coming back to when there's more time. Thank you for listening to that.
Thank you. And sometimes some of my favorite parts of the letter were on page 5 this year. So I understand your interest in page 3. And I think one of the reasons that we don't ask JFO to do a lot of district by district analysis before town meeting day is for this very reason, that they're essentially estimates from districts. They are subject to change. And we want to make sure that we're being as accurate as we can with our model. Someone was back on you. Yes?
Okay.
Did I miss anyone? Okay, great. You never got it. You have.
I have another question, and this goes to something that Jacob actually said. In previous years, I had been told by our local school district that in order to get to your projected education spending, one of the things that came out before you got there was local revenue. And I'd always been told that included in that local revenue was surplus from 2 years prior. So once you had gone through an audit, that surplus had to be counted as local revenue and reduce what you were asking from the ed fund. And I've noticed a shift in this year specifically with folks calling use of surplus from previous years a buy down. Very similar to the way that we talk about it at the state level, but at the local level, I had always heard about that talk as a requirement by the state. Basically, you're putting back into the pot money that you've taken out of the ed fund previously before you go ask for more. But the view seems to have shifted to that being a buy down that's going to put you in the same situation as us buying down property tax rates using money from the general fund or from some other source. And so I just wanted to know, is that something that's actually changed as a directive, or is this just a way that people have changed in the way they talk about it?
I'll start with that a little bit. I think that there is a misconception that folks think that automatically a surplus from the prior 2 years audited has to go against a budget in that subsequent budget year. There is another option for school districts and boards to put forward. They have to put it forward in front of their voters. Typically, they will put it forward in a separate article on the ballot. And that's when they ask to take surplus funds and place them into some kind of reserve. And so if you go to your voters and you say, I want to put $500,000 of surplus from FY25 audited financials into our capital improvement reserve fund, and voters approve that, then that money does not go against your subsequent budget automatically. It is placed into that reserve fund with a specific use purpose that you can't deviate from. And then if you aren't going to put it into reserves, or if your voters do not approve that, that's when you would be including that surplus as local revenue against that budget.
Can I ask two quick follow-up questions?
Yeah, I just want to name that Elizabeth's coming back to talk about reserve guidance next week.
Okay,
So
the two quick follow-up questions are, you said it has to be for a specific use. So how specific does it have to be? Can you just say it's, a stabilization fund essentially for next year's taxes? Or does it have to be something extremely specific like capital improvements? And the second question that you can wrap in as well is there any limit on it? So is there any limit on how much you can put into a reserve fund if your voters approve it?
So it all depends on how you phrase it to your voters, how you've put it on the ballot warning, and if the voters approve it in such way. So there is districts that have education stabilization funds that are more versatile, meaning they can use them for something that came up during the fiscal year that they were not budgeted for or knowingly going to have. Those are called an ed stabilization fund, and they are a reserve, and some voters in some communities have approved them that way. The most of what I see is typically capital improvement reserves. That's those are the vast majority of the reserves that I've seen. I have also seen health insurance reserves, which are specific to health insurance. So it all depends on what you've put in that ballot language, what you've asked your voters, and did they approve? And the same goes for a maximum amount. Typically, when you are asking your voters, you might be just asking for a specific dollar amount, but there are districts who basically put the language into the article that basically says up to a cap of X% of our budget, or up to a cap of X% of our surplus dollars per fiscal year, or whatever. So if they put something like that in there, they're allowed to continue to increase if it's a percentage versus a stagnant dollar amount cap. So it's really based on how they've worded it and what their voters have approved. And yeah, we've got lots more information about what folks do with reserve funds.
Thank you.
I would say yes, as Elizabeth has said, it really does vary a great deal across the state. At Slate Valley, we have a capital reserve, and that's all that we have. So we're always looking at putting before the voters an amount that is approved out of the surplus. We're working with FY25. How much of that will go into our capital projects reserve, and how much of that will use towards our budget. We don't refer to it as a buy down. We do continue to refer to it as use of surplus. And we are, we're always sort of balancing that. We're looking at how much, this year we balanced it a little bit in terms of how much we put into our general fund budget for building maintenance projects. And the thing is, so that the idea is those projects really have to be completed within the fiscal year for that budget. And so that can be a little bit challenging if we don't get our budget passed and we're later and later in the spring. It starts to impact our ability in the new fiscal year for the director of operations to get out bids and things to get projects completed over the summer, which is when a lot of that happens. So we're always looking at how much should go into that reserve, which has more flexibility. It's not as constrained by the fiscal year. But in Slate Valley, that's all we're working with is a capital projects reserve. And it's not large. I mean, it hovers around $1 million. I mean, we don't have a large capital projects reserve. Again, we're continually putting as much as we can back into our budget. And surpluses, that's another thing, where the surpluses come from. They come from a lot of different places. I think more recently, we're finding our surplus is coming from positions we've not been able to fill. And that generates pretty quickly, generates surplus. So hope that helps.
Thanks, Cheryl. That's really helpful. And as we have the reserve guidance conversation next week?
Yes.
Next week. I think there's an interesting piece also of when sort of artificial cost containment measures are placed on districts, how they play out so differently district to district, depending on how much reserves you have, how you've spent them down recently, all of those things. So I'm looking forward to that. I want to thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to make 2 public service announcements before you go. Actually, just one. I said one of them already. Ted, you mentioned the desire for modeling with regards to the foundation formula. I really appreciate that. One concern that I have with doing it too soon is we have not figured out rules for a transportation categorical grant, for special ed, for how we're measuring pre-K students, and what to do with district debt, just as some examples. And so we would be very far from even an apples to oranges comparison at this point. It would be more like pomegranates and mangoes. And so I want to make sure that we can come a little bit closer before we start creating comparison scenarios. And so I'm hopeful that we can get there. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone for a great and very full day and such thoughtful testimony, and see everyone tomorrow. We're going to be talking about pre-kindergarten first thing in the morning, based on the work that Joint Fiscal Office has been doing this year. We don't have a report yet. So if anyone's looking for the report, it's not like in a secret place. It's just not available yet. So we'll be working from that PowerPoint that Emily Byrne shared with us last time she was here. We only went halfway through it. And then also hearing from Morgan Crossman and Jenna McLaughlin on their thoughts on the situation pre-K as it is now. Thank you all. Have a great night.